It was a normal afternoon at Jefferson High. The sun slipped in through the tall classroom windows, casting long shadows on the desks where a group of students sat waiting for their math lesson to begin. The teacher, holding a piece of chalk, was in a playful mood. He looked around, trying to spark laughter before starting the lesson. His eyes landed on a quiet woman sweeping the hallway just outside the classroom door. She was the school janitor, dressed in her usual uniform, holding a mop in one hand and a cleaning bucket beside her. For most people at the school, she blended into the background. Students saw her every day but rarely noticed her. Some teachers greeted her with polite nods, while others didn't pay her any attention at all. She walked the same halls, cleaned the same floors, and worked in silence. Most assumed she was just another worker, someone who probably had no interest in books or studies. That afternoon, the teacher smirked and called her into the classroom. The students giggled, already expecting something amusing. The janitor paused, unsure why she was being summoned, but out of respect, she stepped into the room. The teacher turned toward the blackboard, where a half-finished calculus problem stretched across the surface. The numbers and symbols filled the space, a problem most students would struggle to solve. With a teasing grin, the teacher pointed at the board and said, "Why don't you give this a try?" His voice carried a playful tone, but the words were meant as a joke. The students laughed, some covering their mouths, others whispering among themselves. To them, the idea of the school janitor solving a complicated math problem seemed ridiculous. The woman stood there for a moment, her eyes on the board. She didn't laugh. She didn't show anger either. She simply placed the mop against the wall and walked slowly toward the teacher's desk. The room grew quieter. The students expected her to smile awkwardly or shake her head and leave, but instead, she reached for the chalk. The teacher raised his brows, surprised she was even willing to attempt it. Some students leaned forward in their seats, waiting to see what would happen. A few still whispered, sure this was going to be funny. The woman lifted the chalk with steady hands and began to write at first. The sound of chalk scratching against the board was the only thing anyone could hear. She didn't rush, and she didn't hesitate. Each number she wrote, each symbol she placed, followed the last with purpose. Slowly, the laughter in the room faded. The playful smiles on the students' faces shifted to puzzled stares. Line by line, she worked through the problem. Her handwriting was neat, her steps clear, as though she had solved problems like this many times before. The teacher, still standing beside the desk, tilted his head. His smirk began to disappear. He leaned closer, realizing she wasn't just guessing. She knew exactly what she was doing. The students exchanged glances, their whispers changing tone. No longer mocking, they were filled with curiosity and disbelief. Wait, is she actually solving it? One murmured under their breath. Another sat frozen, their jaw dropping as the janitor calmly wrote the next step. The woman didn't look at anyone. She kept her eyes on the board, her focus sharp. It was as if she had stepped into a world of her own, where the noise around her didn't exist. Her hand moved quickly but carefully, placing every step of the solution in order. A hush fell over the room. The same students who had laughed minutes ago now sat silently, watching as the janitor reached the final step. With one last stroke of chalk, she circled the answer at the bottom of the board. Then she set the chalk down gently on the ledge and stepped back. The classroom remained silent for a moment. The teacher blinked, then looked at the board, his eyes scanning through her work. He traced each step, searching for a mistake, but none appeared. The answer at the bottom was correct. Not just correct, it was perfectly solved, in a way many of his own students often struggled to achieve. A wave of shock rolled through the room. Students gasped, some leaning back in their chairs, others staring wide-eyed at the woman who only moments earlier had been the subject of their laughter. The teacher's face turned stiff, his playful grin long gone. The janitor didn't say a word. She simply wiped her hands on her uniform, picked up her mop, and prepared to leave the classroom as quietly as she had entered. For the first time, the students weren't looking at her as just a janitor. They were looking at her as someone mysterious, someone who clearly held more knowledge than they had ever imagined. The teacher, too, remained silent, his pride stung by what had just unfolded before his eyes. And in that silence, something shifted. A simple act, a solution to a math problem, had turned a moment of mockery into a moment of awe. The classroom stayed frozen in silence after the janitor put the chalk down. For a moment, no one even breathed. A problem that looked impossible just a few minutes earlier was now solved perfectly. And it wasn't by the teacher or a student. It was by the woman everyone thought had nothing to do with academics. The teacher stood stiff beside his desk, eyes locked on the board. He went over the solution again, step by step, hoping to find an error he could point out. But each line was correct, written with a flow only someone deeply familiar with mathematics could produce. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. His playful grin was long gone. The students, who had been expecting the funny scene, now sat speechless. The laughter that once filled the room had turned into wide-eyed shock. Some of them leaned forward, squinting at the board to check for themselves. Others glanced at each other, whispering quietly. "Is this real?" One of them muttered. "She actually did it." Another whispered back. The janitor, however, didn't seem fazed by the stares or the silence. She calmly placed the chalk back on the tray, dusted her hands against her uniform, and turned toward the door. To her, it was just another problem. Nothing more, nothing less, but to everyone else, it was something unforgettable. As she reached for her mop, the tension in the air grew thicker. The students wanted to say something, but they weren't sure what. For the first time, they were seeing her not as the woman who swept their halls, but as someone holding a secret talent that none of them had imagined. The teacher finally cleared his throat. "Well," he began, his voice shaky. He looked at the board again, then back at the janitor. "That was correct." His tone was quiet, lacking the confidence he usually carried when teaching. It was almost as if he himself could not believe what had just happened. The students stared at him, waiting for more, but he didn't continue. The usual authority in his voice was gone. He looked humbled, almost embarrassed. The janitor nodded politely and turned to leave. Her steps were slow but steady, as if this moment held no weight for her. She had simply been asked to solve a problem, and she had solved it. Nothing more. But the weight of it pressed heavily on everyone else in the room. As the door closed behind her, the students burst into whispers. "How did she do that?" One asked, their voice filled with disbelief. "There's no way." "That was harder than anything we've done this year," another added. A few of them shook their heads, still stunned by what they had seen. The teacher tapped the chalk against the board nervously, still reviewing the solution. He could no longer laugh it off as a joke. The truth was right in front of him. The janitor wasn't just good at math, she was brilliant. Meanwhile, in the hallway, the janitor picked up her cleaning bucket and continued down the corridor as if nothing unusual had happened. She moved with her usual calm, pushing her mop and focusing on her work. Students passing by didn't know anything had happened inside the classroom, but those who witnessed it would never forget. Back inside, the mood of the room had changed completely. Just a few minutes ago, the students were restless, waiting for class to begin with jokes and laughter. Now they sat quietly, their minds replaying what they had seen. Even the most talkative students had no witty remarks left. The silence carried an unspoken lesson. Respect cannot be measured by a uniform or a job title. One student finally broke the silence. "She's smarter than all of us," they said softly, almost in awe. A few nodded in agreement. Others still looked stunned, not sure how to process it. The teacher adjusted his glasses and finally addressed the class. "Let's continue with today's lesson," he said, trying to gather himself. But his voice lacked its usual strength, and everyone could sense it. He knew that, in a matter of minutes, the balance of respect in the room had shifted, not in his favor, but toward the quiet janitor who had just revealed her brilliance without even trying. The rest of the lesson dragged on, but the students barely paid attention. Their minds weren't on calculus anymore. They were on her, the woman who had been invisible to them, suddenly shining brighter than anyone else in the room. That evening, some of the students carried the story home. "You won't believe what happened today," they told their families. They described how the janitor, the one who cleaned their hallways every day, had solved a problem even advanced students would struggle with. The parents listened with surprise, shaking their heads in disbelief. The story spread quickly among the students, too. By the next day, whispers about the janitor's unexpected brilliance traveled from one classroom to another. Some retold it with excitement, others with admiration, but no one doubted it anymore. The teacher, however, felt the weight of what had happened most heavily. He had meant to make a joke, to earn a laugh at someone else's expense. Instead, the joke had turned on him. The look in the student's eyes told him everything. His attempt at mockery had backfired, and deep down, though he didn't want to admit it, he knew the truth. He hadn't just underestimated the janitor. He had underestimated a human being, judging her by her job rather than her abilities. That day, a silence hung over the classroom long after the janitor had left. It was the kind of silence that changes how people think, because once respect is earned in such an unexpected way, it can never be taken back. The next morning at Jefferson High, the atmosphere felt different. The whispers that started in one classroom had spread through the halls. Students who hadn't even been present during the incident were already talking about it. "Did you hear what happened in math class yesterday?" One student asked eagerly as they walked with their friends. "Yeah, the janitor solved some crazy problem," another replied. "They said it was calculus." Not even the top students could have done it that fast. The story had grown with each retelling, but one thing remained constant: everyone was astonished. The woman who carried a mop and bucket every day was no longer just the janitor. She was someone far more mysterious now. Inside the math classroom, the teacher tried to focus on his lessons, but the students weren't looking at him the same way anymore. They kept glancing at the hallway door, half expecting her to walk by again. The memory of the chalk moving steadily in her hand, line after line, was still fresh in their minds. Later that day, during lunch break, a small group of students spotted her in the cafeteria, quietly wiping down tables. They exchanged nervous looks before one of them finally approached. "Excuse me," the student said shyly. How did you know how to solve that problem yesterday?" The woman paused, holding the cloth in her hands. She looked at the group of curious faces. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she should answer. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "I used to study mathematics." The student's eyes widened. You studied math? Like in college?" One asked in surprise. She gave a small nod. "Yes, I loved it. Numbers always made sense to me, even when the world didn't. But I had to leave school early. My family needed me to work. So I never finished my degree." The group of students stood frozen, absorbing her words. They weren't mocking her now. They weren't even smiling. Instead, they looked at her with a mixture of admiration and guilt. Admiration for her brilliance, guilt for the way they had once overlooked her. Another student finally spoke. "But you're so good. You solved it like it was nothing." She smiled faintly. "I kept studying on my own." When you love something, you don't let it go, no matter what job you have. Math is like a language I never stopped speaking. Her words struck something deep in the students. They realized she hadn't just been smart, she had been dedicated, working quietly in the background while life demanded other responsibilities. Word of this conversation spread quickly. By the end of the day, Students across the school weren't just whispering about her solving a problem. Now they were talking about her past, about how she had once been a math student with big dreams. The teacher, meanwhile, felt a heavy weight in his chest. He remembered the smirk on his face when he first called her into the room, thinking it would be a harmless joke. But now, the more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. He had tried to make her look foolish in front of his students, but instead he had revealed his own arrogance. That evening, as he graded papers at his desk, he couldn't stop thinking about her words. When you love something, you don't let it go. He realized that while he had a degree and a title, she had something more powerful: passion. Passion that had kept her sharp, even without recognition or opportunity. By the end of the week, the respect she had earned was undeniable. Students began greeting her in the hallways with smiles instead of ignoring her. Some even asked her questions about math, and to their surprise, she always answered with patience and kindness. One afternoon, a group of students gathered around her in the hallway. "Could you maybe teach us sometimes?" one of them asked, almost nervously. She looked at their eager faces and chuckled softly. "I don't know if I'm a teacher anymore," she said. "But you're better than one," another student insisted. "You explain things so clearly. Please." Her heart softened. She had spent so long blending into the background, unseen and unnoticed. Now here she was, being asked to share what she loved most. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of the old dream she once carried. The dream of being in a classroom, not with a mop, but with chalk in her hand. And in that moment, she realized something. Knowledge doesn't disappear just because life takes you on a different path. It stays with you, waiting for the right time to shine. The teacher eventually heard about these hallway mini-lessons, and though part of him felt uneasy, another part couldn't deny the truth. She had inspired his students in a way he never had. The incident that started as a joke had become something bigger. It had revealed a hidden genius, yes, but more than that. It had revealed resilience, passion, and a lesson no textbook could teach. From then on, whenever the students saw her pushing her cart or sweeping the halls, they didn't see just a janitor. They saw someone extraordinary. They saw someone who had once been overlooked but was now impossible to ignore. And slowly, even the teacher began to realize that sometimes the greatest lessons aren't written in books or taught in lectures. Sometimes the greatest lessons walk quietly among us, disguised in ways we never expect. The days that followed felt different for everyone at the school. The janitor who once passed through the halls almost invisible, now carried an air of quiet respect. Students greeted her with nods or shy smiles. Some of them still whispered about the day she solved the calculus problem, while others tried to work up the courage to ask her about math. But beneath her calm demeanor was a story few knew. One evening, as she finished wiping down the classroom windows, a curious student lingered behind. He had been one of the loudest laughers during the day of the incident, and guilt weighed on him since. He hesitated, then finally spoke. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. She looked at him kindly, sensing his unease. "Of course. Why? Why do you work here if you're so good at math?" His voice cracked with genuine curiosity, not mockery. She paused, her hands resting on the window cloth. For a moment, she considered brushing off the question, but something in his eyes made her feel he was ready to listen. So she told him her story. Years ago, when she was young, she had been a star student. Numbers came to her naturally, as though they were part of her heartbeat. Teachers praised her, classmates turned to her for help, and her family dreamed she would become the first in their community to earn a degree in mathematics. She had even earned a scholarship that allowed her to attend a respected college. In those days, she lived and breathed math. She stayed up late, solving equations not because she had to, but because she loved the challenge. Every new formula felt like unlocking a secret hidden in the world. She imagined herself one day standing in front of a classroom, not as a janitor, but as a professor, teaching others to love numbers the way she did. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her father fell ill, and her younger siblings were too small to care for themselves. Bills piled up, and her scholarship didn't cover living expenses. She tried to juggle classes and part-time jobs, but eventually the burden became too heavy. One day, after a long night of worrying about her family's rent and food, she made the hardest choice of her life. She walked into the university office and signed the papers to withdraw. She left behind her dream, not because she wanted to, but because her family needed her more. Tears welled up in the student's eyes as she recounted the story. He had never considered what kind of sacrifices adults carried with them. But even after I left school, she continued, her voice steady, I couldn't give up math. It has always been a part of me. So I studied on my own. I borrowed old textbooks, solved problems late at night after work, and kept learning quietly. Life didn't allow me to teach in a classroom, but it couldn't take away what I knew. The student listened, his guilt deepening. He remembered laughing at her, mocking her without knowing the weight of her journey. I'm sorry, he whispered. She gave a gentle smile. You don't need to be sorry. Life teaches all of us in different ways. What matters is that we learn. Word of her story began to spread after that. Students who once saw her as just a janitor now saw her as someone who had once stood at the edge of greatness, only to be pulled back by circumstances beyond her control. Yet even in the face of hardship, she had never abandoned her passion. The teachers heard the whispers too. Some felt admiration, while others felt a sting of shame for never asking who she really was. The math teacher in particular carried the heaviest guilt. He had mocked her without knowing her sacrifices. And now, the respect his students once gave him had shifted, little by little, toward her. The janitor herself never sought recognition. She continued her work as she always had, sweeping halls, cleaning classrooms, mopping floors. But the students now looked at her differently. They saw her not just as a worker, but as someone who had chosen her family over her own dreams, someone who carried quiet brilliance in her heart. One day, a small group of students approached her in the hallway. We heard about your story, one of them said softly. It's amazing. You gave up so much for your family. She nodded, her eyes warm. Family comes first. Dreams are important, but love and responsibility make us who we are. The students nodded, deeply moved. For the first time, they understood the weight of sacrifice, not the kind you read about in books, but the kind that lives in the heart of people around you every day. As she walked away, her mop bucket rolling beside her, one thought lingered in their minds. True greatness isn't only about what you achieve, it's about what you endure, and how you never let go of what you love, even when life pushes you off course. The school never looked the same again after that day. For years, students had walked past the janitor without a second glance. She was simply part of the background, cleaning floors, dusting windows, making the hallways shine. But now people looked at her with new eyes. Everywhere she went, whispers followed. But they were no longer mocking. They were filled with respect and awe. That's her, students would say quietly. The one who solved the calculus problem. The one who used to be a math scholar. The story had spread so far that even students who didn't witness it firsthand carried it like a legend. And with every retelling, her quiet presence grew larger, turning into something powerful, something inspirational. The teacher, who once called her into the classroom as a joke, found himself unable to shake off his guilt. Each time he saw her pass by, his heart tightened. He remembered the laughter of his students, the smirk on his own face, and then the silence that followed when she solved the impossible. He had tried to humiliate her, but in truth, he had humiliated himself. One afternoon, he stopped her in the hallway. His voice was softer than usual. I owe you an apology, he said. She turned to him, surprised. I shouldn't have treated you that way. I thought it was just harmless fun, but it was wrong. You deserve respect, not just for your intelligence, but for who you are." She studied his face for a moment, then gave a small, gentle smile. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." Her forgiveness, spoken so simply, carried more weight than any lecture. The teacher nodded, humbled. Meanwhile, students continued to gather around her. Some asked her to help them with homework. Others asked about her life. To their amazement, she always took the time to answer, guiding them patiently. She explained math not in complicated terms, but in ways that made it feel simple and clear. Her love for teaching shone through, even in those small moments in the hallway or cafeteria. For many students, those short conversations became lessons they remembered far longer than anything from their textbooks. They realized that brilliance could come from unexpected places, and that respect should never be based on appearances. Slowly, the janitor's presence began to change the culture of the school. Students started treating not only her, but also other workers, cafeteria staff, cleaners, guards with more kindness. They realized that every person walking through those halls carried a story, a struggle, and perhaps even a hidden gift. One day, as she was mopping near the library, a group of students approached with something in their hands. It was a small notebook. "We thought, maybe you could write down some math problems for us to practice," one of them said nervously. She looked at the notebook, then at their hopeful faces. For a moment, her heart swelled. Years ago, she had dreamed of teaching, but life had pushed her away from that path. And yet here she was, surrounded by eager students, holding out a notebook like it was a treasure. She nodded, took the book, and began writing. Line by line, she filled the pages with problems, explanations, and little notes of encouragement. "Don't be afraid of mistakes," she wrote in the margin. "They are steps to learning." The student smiled, clutching the notebook like it was something precious. From that day on, she became more than a janitor to them. She was a quiet mentor, a guide who reminded them that learning wasn't about grades, it was about curiosity and persistence. Respect she earned grew not from loud speeches or recognition, but from humility, kindness, and a love for knowledge that never faded. No matter where life placed her, years later, long after those students had graduated, many of them still remembered her. Some spoke of how her story pushed them to work harder, to never judge others, and to believe in hidden potential. Others remembered her notebook filled with problems, the simple words of encouragement that kept them going when math felt impossible. And the lesson that lingered above all was this: greatness isn't defined by job titles, uniforms, or social status. True greatness is carried quietly, revealed in moments when the world least expects it. The janitor had walked into a classroom as the subject of a joke, but she walked out as a living lesson. She taught without standing at the front of the room. She inspired without ever asking for attention. And in the end, she proved something unforgettable. Every person has a story, every person has value, and sometimes, the genius you overlook is the one who changes the way you see the world forever.